All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, and thank you for coming today to the Multiculturalism of Women Leaders panel. And we have 5 exceptional panelists today, and I am your first moderator. My name is Lynn Howard, and we have a second moderator, Sandy Lamb, also floating around somewhere here. So we are really excited about our speakers, and excuse me while I navigate. So I want to do a quick introduction. And when I say your name and do your intro, if you don't mind raising your hand and just letting everybody know who you are. We have 5 exceptional leaders with us. So first we have Sharon Gutierrez. She is a US-based Latina marketing coach, tech founder, and speaker, a full-time entrepreneur for over a decade. She passionately believes in using her platform to fight for equality and respect for women everywhere. She is a true leader. She's ran organizations, hosts conferences, and does a lot of things in the leadership space, not just with her community, but also globally. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Sumida Huaman, is a Huanca and Quechua from Montero Valley, Peru. And hopefully I'm not chopping this up, Dr. Elizabeth. An associate professor at the University of Minnesota. She's also an Indigenous education researcher, a thought leader, and highly respected and published across the Americas for her work. Next, we have Lakeesha Ransom, originally from the US, but she's currently in Bangkok at the Asian Institute of Technology. She has a passion for and a strength in connecting diverse people and ideas in a meaningful way and unique ways. Her background and leadership vision are best described in the space where industry, academia, and public service meet. So thank you, Lakeesha. Then we also have Associate Professor Zilka. She is the faculty of philosophy, University of Zenica, and in London. She's a scholar, a teacher, a trainer, a human rights activist, addressing cutting-edge issues involving education, leadership, gender, religion, and peace building, with more than 15 years of experience in academia training, research, training, and work in the governmental and non-governmental sectors. And last but not least, we have Vanessa Parker, based in North Carolina in the US. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and clinician at trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. Vanessa is also co-founder and president of the Marie-Aline Gay Heart for Haiti Foundation, a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering and promoting the overall well-being of Haiti, her descendants in the US and across the globe throughout community outreach, mental health support, and leadership development. Vanessa enjoys spending time with her husband and 3 amazing kids. Let's give a warm welcome to all 3 panelists. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited. All right. So let's go ahead, and I just want to give a quick note to the audience how this is going to run. And so first, every speaker is going to be asked different questions. It will run for 3 minutes each. They will all have 3 minutes, and it's for 90 minutes long. And if you have any questions, go ahead and type it into the chat, and we'll go ahead and try to address them if we can. Please take notes, and if you feel moved or connected with any of the panelists, don't forget to find them on social media and like and follow them as well. All right, ladies, shall we get started? Yes. All right, so I'll have you unmute yourself as you're asked a question. So I'm going to go ahead and start with, actually this question I want to ask to all of you, and I'll go with each of you. And the first question is, how do you actually define multiculturalism? So let's go ahead and ask Zilka first. What's your definition of multiculturalism?
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be part of this panel. Yeah, and thank you for having me. I think everyone has his or her own definition, but for me, multiculturalism is more or less about diverse ethnic, national, religious, racial backgrounds and people of different backgrounds. But we can look at it also and interpret it in the way that it can be seen descriptively as a sociological phenomenon, but also prescriptively as an ideology that imposes something, but also politically with some policies that we can also adopt and promote. So ideologically, multiculturalism is a set of ideas and ideals, and we celebrate cultural differences and diversities in multicultural societies, and we have examples and modern societies strive towards that. For me, as an activist and also a researcher, it is important always to connect what we research about multiculturalism with policy level to see how it works in practice. So to make these kind of connections. And it is also important when we talk about multiculturalism that we don't talk about assimilation or melting pot in classical terms, but instead of that, to have multiculturalism that integrate different cultures, so that each group or each individual can preserve what is particularly important to her or him, and at the same time to get integrated well in the culture where they live. So yeah, more or less, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Zilka. Vanessa, how about you? What would be your definition?
I definitely have to agree with Zilka. It's that amalgamation of different cultures coming together. But I think the biggest takeaway for me in that example is not having to feel the pressure of assimilating into the greater context of society, right? That wherever we are a part of. So I think, speaking from experience, coming from Haiti at the age of 12, very impressionable age, but that was also a very challenging time for me, because the expectation I felt at the time was that I needed to forego my language, forego my culture, my historical background, my belief system, my faith that was solidified by my grandmother. And I needed to just kind of take part into that melting pot that Zilka mentioned, right? So I needed to conform to what the norm was in that time for me. So I think there's such beauty in the aspect of multiculturalism when we're able to celebrate, recognize, and accept that we are all so different, but we bring such great experiences to the table. And that's the beauty of it all. So that's how I define multiculturalism.
Thanks, Vanessa. How about you, Elizabeth?
Ayon chukashan kichi somak punchao turai kunan kuna. It's good to see everyone. I am uncomfortable with the term multiculturalism, which is a little bit ironic since this panel is on the multiculturalism of women in leadership. I, as an educational researcher, have seen the way in which multiculturalism has become sort of a crusade and an industry. It is an invented approach to normalize the alternative other ways of being, other ways of knowing, other ways of looking, other ways of doing. You know, and part of this, I think, also ironically comes from being trained as an anthropologist in my early days by critical anthropologists who were fixated on the phenomenon of what is culture, but at the same time were attempting to dismantle that phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that we tend to reduce entire people, geographies, places, religions, beliefs, experiences into these compartments that we then refer to as culture. And then I think the problem is a temptation to then qualify and categorize them. And always through the Western gaze, or always, or the imperial gaze. So I think what we really have to ask then is, you know, when do we talk about culture? How do we talk about culture? Who's multiculturalism? What are the ways in which multiculturalism then checks a lot of boxes for people? You know, and so I'm more a proponent of considering different approaches towards thinking about what it means to be a human in this universe, in our particular universe, connected to our particular places. And there's a term for that, you know, developed by scholars who actually learned from indigenous peoples, scholars like Arturo Escobar, who talk about the pluriverse. So what does it mean to think about cultures as then not just people, but also our relationship with places, and in relationship to the ways in which we understand why we're here, what is our purpose for being here, and the values that are associated with those.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Before I ask Lakeesha and Sharon, I do want to give the, you brought up a good point, and the definition that I found on the web says coexistence of diverse, where culture includes racial, religion, cultural groups, and is manifested in customary beliefs, cultural assumptions, and values, patterns of thinking, and communicative styles. So I think a lot of what you brought up there is also defined in that. Lakeesha, what about you?
Sure. So it's really interesting because rather than maybe respond in a theoretical way, or I guess what I would like to do is share a bit about my life here now in Bangkok, you know, working at the Asian Institute of Technology, which has been named for several years as being the most international, having the strongest international orientation of any institution in the world. So in my past, I've served as a chief diversity officer. I've worked in the Office of Multicultural and Academic Affairs in the US, and that was very much centered around, you know, the norms that Elizabeth mentioned in terms of the labels that, you know, we ascribe to different groups of people. You know, in my current space, in my current world, when I think about the faculty meetings, every colleague that I have in my department is from a different place, different language background, you know, several different, you know, religions. So Thai, Libyan, half Egyptian, half French, Australian, all in one person, you know, Bangladeshi, British, you know, and these are, it's not one-off, you know, it's the faculty colleagues, our staff is equally diverse from Thailand, Philippines, Myanmar. And so really for the first time in my life, I feel as though I'm living it. And even in my neighborhood, you know, I think about my closest friends, you know, they just happen to be people, but, you know, from Berlin, from, you know, a Canadian who is half, you know, British, half Chinese, grew up in Nepal, but, you know, and so people bring their entire selves, and there really doesn't seem to be a dominant culture in my world right now, which is really quite unique. And I think sometimes unique for me, at least, you know, because our, you know, standard language of communication is English. But even within that, there's British English, Australian English, American English. And so there's a strong sense of awareness of being cognizant of maybe differences that we have, and then similarities that we share.
Thank you, Dr. Lakeesha. And Sharon.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, this is a very complex topic. Can I just say that? I really appreciated, Elizabeth, what you said and the different perspectives. For me, multiculturalism, as I was thinking about actually like for this panel a little bit last night, you know, I am Mexican and Caucasian. I'm mixed. I've lived my life looking in ambiguous brown. So it's constantly being evaluated from so many different perspectives and put in boxes, or people who cannot put me into a box wanting immediately to, you know, comment on it or, you know, try and make that distinction. So when I was thinking about diversity, this could have just as easily been a diversity panel versus multiculturalism. Diversity, it's something that you can also apply to having diverse stocks, or there's a diverse group of buttons, like all of these things. Multiculturalism to me is more people-centric and also is a lot about identity. You know, there's so many different, there's a lot of depth to the word, I believe. And so in what I do, you know, and as a speaker and all of these different things, I feel like being aware of, like, seeing and educating myself about the different perspectives that people are coming from, and being able to speak to those things, but also making the stance and taking the stance as an ally, that is so important with my privilege. And being able to talk about that over and over again, and being able to say that it's not just about race, or it's actually about like cultural backgrounds, and knowing that just myself, I have so many different backgrounds that are coming and speaking into my existence. That is the depth of the word for me. So yeah, that's my response.
Excellent. Oh, ladies, you brought up such great points. I do have to make a comment. As a child growing up, my mom always said that she hated checking off the boxes. A couple of you said that, and Elizabeth, you started it. And my mom's like, would always write human and put a box next to it and check that. As a young child, I remember that. So great, ladies. This next question will be for Lakeesha. Lakeesha, what do you feel is your greatest asset that you bring to such a melting pot, living overseas and being in an academia setting? What attribute do you feel that you bring to this as a leader and with the multiculturalism theme? And why is that important?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in much the same way that Vanessa mentioned in her own life journey, mine began when I was 7. So my parents migrated from within the United States, from Mississippi and Arkansas to Flint, Michigan, where I was born. And then we moved every 3 years with my father's job. And so I learned early in life that if I wanted to have friends, I needed to be able to understand other people. And so it was a skill that I built, but I didn't realize that I was building, and it wasn't always easy. And it was 20 years ago. I was living on a ship. The Japanese Prime Minister's office, you know, sponsored this program for young people from around the world. And so there were 10 people from each of 14 countries who lived on a ship for a few months. And one of my Kenyan friends, she pulled me aside and said, Lakeesha, I don't get it. You know, you're with the US delegation and you get along, you know, you with the other members of your delegation, but then I see you with the Kenyans and the Greeks and the Sri Lankans. And only then did I realize that the journey that I had been on over the course of my life had prepared me for being in multicultural environments. And so maybe some of the culture shock that would normally happen, you know, by moving halfway around the world, yes, it certainly occurs, but my entire life has been about that. And so what I think that it has done is that it's helped me to develop, and I'm continuing to develop empathy, you know, in terms of how do I help to create a safe space for people to connect and to recognize the value that they bring and that the value that other people around them bring to the environment. And then how can we collaborate and, you know, develop some, you know, amazing work together. So I believe that's what I bring. It wasn't necessarily by choice, but maybe just by my own life design, and I'm thankful for it. But I guess it's part of what makes me unique.
Excellent, thank you. And Elizabeth, during our initial conversations, you spoke about your grandmother and how she was quite the leader in her community. Could you please share with that under this theme, that story, and why it's important to learn from the type of person and the type of human that your grandmother was?
Thanks, Lynn. So I'd like to begin by saying, I think when we occupy this fixation on culture, then we are there's too much of a temptation or a leaning towards understanding culture according to the external trappings. So what people look like, dress like, where they're from, what languages they speak, what belief systems they hold. When in reality, the idea of who people are and the lived experience of who people are comes down to several things. It comes down to their epistemology, how they know what they know and what they know. It comes down to their ontology, which is how they understand their existence to be, the why are we here, the answer to that question. And then thirdly, their axiology or their value systems. So I'm only interested in culture so far as it addresses those pieces, those aspects. And I think that Indigenous communities have a lot to answer or a lot to provide to that conversation and have been addressing and answering that for generations. My grandmother was one of those people. Her name is Antonieta Jesusa Carhuamaca. De Huaman. She was married to my grandfather, and the Huaman part comes from my grandfather. So according to Spanish tradition, it was De Huaman. She was of Huaman. But her last name, Carhuamaca, is a very old name, a Huanca name that comes from our part of the region, the Montaro Valley, and it refers to the landscape. It's a plant. It's a flowering plant. And so my grandmother was not a leader in the traditional sense. She was not an elected leader, according to any governance standards. But the way in which she has been remembered in my community and in my family is based on her value systems, is based on her generosity. And I think there has to be space, right? Because we can say we want Quechua leaders, we want Huanca women leaders. But I think that we have to understand that there is heteroglossic difference. So even though we might be speaking the same language, we might be from the same community, there are so many distinct ways that we can approach how we deal with other people, how we work in community, and how we share who we are. And so my grandmother was one of those incredibly generous people who had, I think, the spirit of the heart, who always gave of herself in a time and in a place where that wasn't always the norm.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Zilka, I'd like to bring it over to you because you've done a lot of work in, like I said in your bio, the governmental and the non-governmental areas, but a lot of activist work. What would you say is maybe one of the biggest successes you've had in the multiculturalism of women leaders realm with your activist work? Wait, unmute.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. When I'm thinking about that, there have been so many things that I acquired and I'm proud of, but I would like to go back 25 years ago when I was very young, and what I have done in the midst of horror of the war and terrible destruction in the Balkans region. And I even didn't know that I had it in myself, the leadership potential. But basically, in the midst of horror, sometimes we discover what we can do and what we are capable to do. So I discovered at that time in 1990s that I had capacity to help with trauma healing with wartime rape victims, women and children. So it was really inspirational, very hard, but at the same time, very inspiring and encouraging to me. And few weeks ago, I met a girl who greeted me and said, you know, you named me 25 years ago, and I was surprised, and of course didn't know who she was. And she said, I'm a child born out of war, and my mom was one of the raped women in the center where you worked. So thanks to you, my mom decided to keep me, and you were the one to give me a name and to convince my mom's family to keep me. So I was really surprised, and I knew that I and many other women at the time have done a lot to help these women, but I didn't know how much it was important for individual lives, like the life of that young lady. So I was really, I was touched, and I was thinking, oh my God, I mean, it was really important what I have done it in that time, and I haven't had a clue how important it was that. So I'm really proud of myself from that period, and also I'm proud of my intercultural journey that I undertook with the group of people.
Thank you, Zilka. We'll come back to you with that. Save that answer for later. Sharon, let me come to you. How do you, let me rephrase that. What attributes do you believe makes a strong leader, not just as a woman, but in general? And the second part to that is, what on top, do you feel women have to have different traits or do something different to be a strong leader?
Thank you. Well, some of the things that I believe create a strong leader are, one, vision, being able to see where we're steering the boat, and also empathy. I think that people talk a lot about confidence versus arrogance, and I do believe confidence is incredibly important, and the differentiation between the two, and we start to get into the space of arrogance, is empathy. A leader who has arrogance believes that they know everything and look down upon their people, where a leader who has confidence knows and believes in their skill set and the vision and the ability to make something happen, but they believe that they're with their people and among their people. With those traits as leaders, I think that women, they are equally important, but I think that we shouldn't have to, but sometimes we do have to navigate it a little bit different. I don't know if we even have to actually navigate it different, but if we showcase those traits, our confidence comes across as arrogance to men a lot of time. If I say that this is where I'm going, I'm really good at it, and we're gonna make this happen, then somebody might, take that as arrogance. And so I think that, we have to constantly make the decision of how we're gonna filter ourselves or show up, right? We always wanna hold true to our authenticity, but I do believe that women, we do have to navigate it a little bit different, or just, be aware that people are gonna misconstrue, and so make sure that we're heard. We might have to say a few more words to make sure we get our point across. And also, with male egos and all of that as well. But I think that, yeah, vision, confidence, and empathy are things that are important in leadership.
Thank you for that. And to add to that, with you being Latino and you are mixed, interracial, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where do you feel, are there different attributes that you've had to use because of that? And you said in your intro that, because of your skin tone, that people often look at you and they're not quite sure. So have you had to adapt anything else?
I think that, honestly, as we navigate life, we have one race card and we have one sex card. Like, if I were to say that this happens, and it's happened because I'm a woman, and I can, complain about something that happens, right? You get to complain once before people start saying, okay, it's your fault, something, obviously you invited something to happen. You only get one instance. And I feel like it's the same way too, as far as a discriminatory practice or something being racist being said. And so I feel like I have those two cards in my pocket. And I think that's something as women and as minority women and leadership that we're constantly trying to evaluate, when do we use our cards? When do we actually speak up and say something? because if we use it too soon, I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's how I've had, like, that's something that I'm aware of. And so as I continue on in leadership and, you know, hold those two cards and different things happen, and I'm getting more and more comfortable speaking up, not just for myself, but for others, and saying, no, this is not okay. That's discriminatory. You know, I feel like, oh man, I've used up my cards. People are starting to say, oh, she's sensitive. She's sensitive because she's constantly saying something. And again, I come back to my original point about privilege. Like, I do have privilege in my ambiguity, you know, and the lighter color of my skin. And so I was having that conversation actually with a Caucasian woman, and she, you know, tried to correct me. And she said, you don't have privilege. Like, because I was saying with my privilege, I feel like it's important that I have to speak up more. And she's like, you don't have privilege. You're Mexican and you grew up poor and you don't have, you know, didn't get the strongest education when you were younger and all of these things. And I was, no, that is not true. I mean, it's those facts are true, but I still have element of privilege. We all do, right? And so, I know that's a long answer to that, but it goes back to how do you navigate as a woman leader and as a minority? Speak up. We have to speak up more for people that are not able to. And it's something I'm constantly aware of. But those are my two cards that I have in my pocket at all times, even though I've used them.
Thank you, Sharon. And Vanessa, I want to turn over to you and ask about, I mean, you speak up for the Haitian community. You built a nonprofit to teach leadership and empowerment. So what would you like to add to these questions that have been asked?
Yeah, no, I appreciate all of the answers. And as Sharon shared, you know, it's being able to be grounded in your belief system, right? Understanding that you have some privileges. So I think of myself coming from Haiti as a young girl and now growing up in this culture, and having privileges that a lot of my younger Vanessas back home or even here in the States do not have. And so when I, as a woman leader in my position, I think about that. I'm very aware of how am I representing myself? How am I being powerful in my own right, utilizing my voice to speak up for those that are unheard? And that's one of the purposes for the foundation, and is allowing people to be empowered, providing resources to them, but also helping them to understand that you have a voice, that you can speak up for what it is that you need. And as I was able to do it, this is the path that I use. I want to reach back and grab along someone with me and say, hey, these are the ropes. These are some of the things that you can do to help bring you forward. And if leadership is the situation or the position or the goal, the dream that you want to accomplish, it's very possible for you. There's room at the table. And so that's the approach that I take, is helping people to understand that you have power within you, you have strength, approaching it with compassion. I think one of the questions you asked is, what are some of the characteristics to bring as a leader? For me, it's connecting with people. It's the ability to communicate with people, making them feel comfortable, and helping them to understand that we have a lot more in common than we do differences. And so that's really how I approach it.
Thank you. A follow-up question. You had spoke about you show them the path. This is the path that you took, or some steps. Would you mind giving one or two of those steps along your path? And that way others that are listening could possibly work towards being a better leader or being a more open-minded or whatever they're working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background also includes human resources before becoming a clinician, right, a psychotherapist. And in that space, one of the things that I learned was to be at the table, but to listen, pay attention, observe how differences show up in the room, different cultures, right? How do we use those tools so that when we step in the light and we're able to share our experiences, they can be seen clearly and understood clearly? So that's one of the steps that I took, was to be able to listen, but also a part of it was to be a team player, to engage with anyone at any level, whatever that position was, that I could sit at the table, but also step out of my position and lend a hand to someone, not to be afraid to still be the leader, but support the different departments of my organization, wherever it was that I was working. So that's one of the steps that I took. Being a student learner is another one, right? Paying attention to what are the tools that are out there available, what resources out there are available, being willing to learn, not just in an academic setting, but in my community. Learning from the women, the DV shelters I've supported, learning from church community groups, learning from my family, listening to my clients' experiences and the things that they've gone through, and how I can use all of that to help me to have that level of empathy, to have that level of compassion that is necessary to be a leader. So those are all, there's so many different steps. I feel like I'm rambling on, but those are some of the steps that have been helpful to me.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that, Vanessa. Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to you. Speaking of learning, I know that you have worked with a lot of indigenous tribes. I believe you said in Phoenix, or excuse me, Arizona or New Mexico. And I'd love to ask you to share about your experience with working with those leaders and training them and creating community. Where do you feel the woman leader is in that space, and what role do they play, and why is it important?
As Lynn has mentioned, I'm a comparative education researcher, and so I work with tribal nations and institutions really across the Americas. So in Southwestern Ontario, Canada, and here in Northern Minnesota, as well as in the Southwestern US, and then across the Andes, and in Latin America and South America. And, you know, every community, even within a particular nation, you know, within a particular sovereign nation or self-determined aspiring nation, is going to have a different approach, particularly in relation to colonization. So that question is actually really complicated, because we could say that, you know, such and such, like Diné, you know, or Navajo, or some sort of Puebloan or Quechua or Oneida leader or leadership structure looks like this, you know, and the place of women is here and the place of men is here. But in reality, there's some incredible work that's being done by Indigenous peoples from these communities who are asking, well, what really is ours? You know, what is ours? What has been adopted and modified through colonial structures and laws and policies that actually isn't serving us well, but that we've then taken on and claimed and renamed as quote unquote traditional. And so we see in these communities a lot of nuanced discussions around what does it mean to create structures of leadership that perpetuate Indigenous self-determination, which is how do people want to live? You know, what do they see for their lives? What do they want to enact for their lives? And self-development, how do they wish to do so over time? And, you know, I see a lot of conflation, unfortunately, and I'll give an example. I see conflation of men, women, masculinity, femininity, and they're not the same things. So for example, in the Quechua world and in our language, there is a term for, there is masculinity and there's femininity, but they are fluid spaces and they are fluid according to time. So something that might be considered male, so for example, Mother Universe is considered a woman, right? And so, you know, popular discourse has created this image of this mother figure, when in reality, she can be very masculine at times. And so that conflation, I think, is really troubling, because the male can embody femininity and can honor femininity, and the female can embody and honor masculinity as well. However, there's a caveat to that, and I do see well, I'll continue later.
Well, I love that you brought up the that idea, or that about the difference between masculinity and femininity, and that it doesn't mean that just because we're a female, we are all feminine, and just because we're a man, we're all masculine. Zilka, I'd love to turn it over to you. Being so actively involved in many communities and in academia. Where would you say that, I'd like you to add to essentially what Elizabeth said about the feminine and the masculine and where it plays a role in all of the work that you've done. Zilka, unmute yourself.
Okay. I did a lot of research on gender and leadership, and I also teach leadership skills at academia and in a civil society sector. And I'm pretty much aware of gender differences, but also how the power dynamic works in every particular context, especially in context with prevailing patriarchal structures, oppressive structures, in post-conflict societies. And sometimes it is really hard to navigate leadership and also to convince women to stand up for themselves and then to have voice, to believe that they can do more, etc. In the recent studies I conducted with two of my colleagues, when we interviewed leaders in politics and business, they are high profiled leaders in both fields. We learned that still many women do not even believe that they are leaders. So they would rather use other words, not leaders, facilitators, those who help, or something else, which is really interesting to me. You can see that they lead, they have qualities of a really great leader, but they're not willing to admit that they are leaders. So somehow in the culture, being a leader is associated with tough political figures. So many women still do not find themselves, to be tough figures, but they want to nurture some qualities that are more feminine, and then they don't want to be judged as women are. In many cases are judged when they are take leadership positions. They're judged based on their gender, not based on their accomplishments. So I've seen that, and that's why I decided, to launch several projects to help women, to empower them to believe, and somebody has already mentioned that believe that you can do something, have faith, and also being ready to expose yourself, and be ready to negotiate also your place when you are in leadership position. So I think women really need to be empowered more, and through the networks of other women, but also men, through mentorship and other kinds of support.
Thank you. Your time is up. I appreciate that. I do want to ask a general question to the panel. I'm going off script a little bit, and then Lakeesha, I'm going to come to you for a follow-up question. But Zilka and Elizabeth, you both, I saw in the comments, Elizabeth, you spoke about the assault towards women, or the femininity, and Zilka, you were talking about the power. My question to the panel is, as women and as women leaders, have you felt uncomfortable owning that leadership title? Can I get a raise of hands for those of you that have? Okay, Lakeesha, I'm going to come to you, and I want you to share your story of, why were you uncomfortable? And I actually want to ask a couple of you to share what made you uncomfortable.
Oh, I misunderstood. I thought you asked whether I was comfortable. Maybe it was a glitch.
Oh, uncomfortable. So have you ever felt threatened or uncomfortable because of a situation when you were a leader? Because it might be more masculine, or because there's just, it's not a supportive environment for a woman. Have any of you felt that way?
I can speak to that
Yep,
briefly.
please.
It might be slightly differently nuanced, but so I served on the Board of Regents at the University of Minnesota 20 years ago. So I was 20 years younger than I am now, still Black and still a woman. And so at the time, I don't think we ever had more than 3 female regents at a time. And I was younger by 20 years of everyone. And so that was really the first time that I felt, you know, the balance, the counterbalance of all of those identities coming together. And, you know, I'd grown up my entire life being maybe the only, you know, African-American person in a room, or, you know, one of few women, but to have the trifecta of my age, my ethnicity, and my gender, and yet still having the responsibility of growing into a role, serving alongside people who had reported directly to, you know, presidents of the United States of America, and coming to see them as colleagues. You know, so there was one of my colleagues, Bob Berglund, and it probably took me 2.5 years to call him Bob, because I mean, he was U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under President Carter. He was like my grandfather's age, you know, and so, you know, growing into all of that, and then still, you know, having the responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility of governing an institution, meant that I had to use my voice, that I was still developing. I was in my 20s at that time. So it was uncomfortable, but I am grateful for the experience, because I think that it helped me to grow in so many different ways.
To follow up that question, what would you say was one thing, if you could name one thing that helped you step more into that role and kind of push past the uncomfortableness? What would that have been? If you could name one thing. Lakeesha.
You know, actually, yeah, it was the way that my colleagues brought me in. You know, so Bob Berglund would say, "No, we're colleagues, call me Bob." You know, or, you know, so different people would insist that even though they were my parents or my grandparents' generations, like, no, we're one of 12 people at this table, and you're one of us, and we need your voice. And so I think it's the importance of having those types of people. And I think it links back to, you know, something that Sharon and maybe even Zilka, as these two ladies were speaking about their experiences. It's important to have other people in the room that can be that voice, so that we don't always have to say, "Oh, you must not have heard me when I said it the first time, so I'll repeat myself." I mean, maybe I don't say that, but sometimes that's how I feel on the inside. So to have someone who, you know, is standing side by side, helping women to grow into their leadership, I think it's vital.
Absolutely.
For all leaders, but
absolutely.
I'm thankful for those people who have.
Absolutely, Keisha. Thank you. And I would agree that this panel, even though we're talking about the multiculturalism of women leaders, that these are all aspects and tools, regardless if you're male or female, or fluid, and you can take it and use it, and probably align with a lot of the stories. I think all of you raised your hand. I'd love to hear from Vanessa. What about you, and what got you through that uncomfortableness or that time?
Yeah, so when I think back, this was over a decade ago. In this position, I was with a nonprofit in a leadership position, and in a human resources role. And, you know, there was just this sense that as a woman, and especially a Black woman, with a different language, right, speaking French and or Haitian Creole, that I did not somehow earn the opportunity, that I was not in the right setting. I somehow was less than, that I didn't deserve or was worthy of the position that I was in. And I can think of one incident where one of the individuals I encountered, and I was primarily in the Caucasian environment, he was very quick to remind me of that, very quick to remind me of the power that he had within the organization I was working for, and how much money he made, and how much his heritage, the money from his grandfather, helped to build the business that I was supporting and working for. So, you know, that was just an interesting situation that I found myself in. But I think something that helped me was that at the time, my executive director was female. And she was an amazing woman in helping me to understand that regardless of what he might have thought, she supported me. She was there to back me up, and she stood up for me, which was important. And I think Dr. Lakeesha just mentioned that, having other people around who can support you, right? So you don't feel isolated, but that can stand up and speak up with you. So having that support from her helped me feel empowered, right? Because I knew my job, I was prepared for it. I was informed. I was doing the right thing at the moment, whether he liked it or not. But the ability to be confident was supported by her. The ability to be able to communicate what I thought and to feel empowered as a woman leader was supported by her. And so I'm always indebted to her for being there and supporting me through that. And I think that that's an important piece when we think about women in leadership, is opening the door for others and supporting others to feel empowered in their position, so that they don't feel isolated, but that they have others who care, who are there to support and engage with them, and back them up in whatever decisions, you know, that they make. So that's what helped me through it.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I do have to add, before, I definitely want to ask Zilka, Sharon, and Elizabeth also to add to this, because I think it's really important to hear, is it's great that you have people around you that supported you on your journey, but you guys were also open to hear and be supported. A lot of people sometimes in those positions, regardless male, female, they're not open to hear the support of the others, just because they can put themselves in a defensive mode. So I think that's beautiful. Zilka, let me come to you, and then I'll go to the other two ladies. How about you? And if you have a story where maybe you didn't have support, and you found something within or something external, I'd love to hear that. Or if you had support as well.
Yeah, I just remember one of the examples when I was part of the group of scholars in Austria, in Vienna, and among the 16 of white men, I was the only woman, and we discussed the strategy for Southeast Europe for leadership of young people and women, and I was the only woman in the group. And during the discussion, I proposed something to the group, and they didn't pay attention. And I thought at a moment, okay, maybe it was not good. Okay, they didn't pay attention. Half an hour after that, a colleague from Belgium proposed the same as I did. And they started praising him. Wonderful, how wonderful idea. Let's write it down. This is really great for our strategy. And then I was thinking for a second, what should I do? And then I raised my hand and I stood up for myself and I said, I'm sorry, I think we have gender issue here. And then they all were terrified with what I said. And I said, if you go back, because you recorded this session, you'll notice that I proposed the same thing half an hour ago. And nobody noticed that. So I would like you to write it down as my proposal. And after that, for 2 days, as we were working together, they continue apologizing to me. And I said, yeah, you should apologize.
I think we all need to give a clap for that one. That's amazing. And I saw all of us on the screen except for Sandy. Sandy has her picture up, but I'm sure she was nodding her head. That's happened to all of us, where we've said something out loud and because we're not the dominant in the room, that it's glossed over or not even paid attention to. So Elizabeth, I'd like to come to you with the same question, and an attribute or something that somebody can use to get past this if it happens to them.
Yeah, with Zilka's story, I think we're all nodding because there are those moments when you're not heard. It's like people can't hear you. And it's that invisibility and that voicelessness that I think is a quality of the feminine upon which there is a continuous assault. And so I think in terms of leadership, it comes down to who you believe you're accountable to. So in the university setting or in a corporate setting, the nonprofit world, wherever I am, that is very much a corporate function. I find myself to be quite masculine. So I love Zilka's story because I do speak up for myself. But I will say that it comes at tremendous emotional cost because it is not something that I enjoy doing. I don't enjoy calling people out on certain things. There is strength to that that I think is tremendously important. Yet at the same time, I think as human beings, as creatures, as sentient creatures, we also crave nurturing, and we crave affirmation, and we crave compassion, and ultimately love. The Hawaiians refer to aloha as love or understanding as the ultimate ontological purpose. This is why we are here, is for love. And so, to me, I am accountable to the women in my community, to the Indigenous women in the communities where I go and do field work. So I don't consider myself a leader. So when I raise my hand to say I feel uncomfortable, because I have so much to learn. So my proximity to our knowledge systems is so much farther down and so much more in development than the women in our communities. So I have more to learn from them because of my generation, because my knowledge is not as full as theirs. And a lot of it, of course, comes down to age, but it also comes down to investment. Where have I put my learning? Who has invested in my learning? And it's primarily been a lot of Western education. So my mission and my work has been to go back and to recover, to ask those questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? What do we believe? And the people who I believe are the leaders, the women who I am accountable to, those are the real leaders in my community. And I'll give you one example, and I think it's really important for us to remember this. When I was down in the southwestern state of New Mexico in the U.S., I was with a woman who was introducing me to members of the community. She pointed out, men in the community who held these leadership positions. She said, "That's so and so. That's so and so. This is the role that they hold." And then she pointed finally to a woman and said, "And that's the woman who put them there." So, I think that there are lots of knowledge systems from which we can draw.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to that. Sharon, I don't want to leave you out. How about you?
What was the question? Sorry, we went on like several tangents.
we did. The question is if you were ever put in a position where you felt uncomfortable as a leader and what got you through it. That'd be the quick version of the question.
The quick version. Oh my goodness. So many times when Vanessa, when you were talking, you just struck so many different chords with me of the support system and having somebody stand up for you. When we first started this particular thread, I kept thinking about, it was a few years ago. I think that a lot of us in our experiences and our growth in our careers, right, we've learned a lot. And so when you go back to your 20-year-old self and those experiences as a young, ambitious Latina in the tech world trying to do something, it was a lot. And so I remember going to this conference. It was one of my first major conferences on search engine optimization. And I went with one of the guys that worked for me. And there was a room of 200 men and me. There was one other woman. And I was like, oh, okay, it was this agency owners. And I remember going to that event and actually I was one of the top agencies in that room. And as far as revenue based, and going and interacting, and first of all, being so excited to see another woman. So I, went up and introduced myself, and I'm like, okay, we're here to support each other. And she's like, oh no, I'm here for my husband, I'm out. And like, she left, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I remember feeling like so deserted. I was like, she could have sat with me, something. I was so nervous. And then just like going through that event and engaging and having the discussions, and how lowly I was spoken to over and over and over again, with the comments, and also just the pure like disregard for even being, the owner of the business. Any questions that were technical, that weren't about, what did I want to drink, were referred to my, to the person who worked for me. And I'll never be so, like, I'm just so thankful for his response, which was so gentle over and over again. And like, well, she's my boss, let me refer back to her. She's my boss, let me refer back to her. And we played this dance for, 2 days. And it was so, like, Elizabeth, like you said, choosing to stand up and choosing to say something, like, it is a choice, and it does come at an emotional cost. And so I think about the support that it takes. And I think that story, it comes back to me over and over again, but it's such an illustration of like how powerful that support system and how important that ally is. And without that, I mean, that's how I navigate like most of my life, is walking into a room and doing a quick check and say, is there anyone that looks like me? Like, no. Okay, cool. Like, then we're going to do this. And yes, there's definitely like huge events that affect us, but I think if anything, sometimes it feels more like a death by 1,000 cuts. It's the microaggressions or the comments and the constantly needing to, just hearing people attempt to put you in your place or disregard your opinion or not hear you. That's the everyday life that we live. And so it's the constant like showing up and choosing again and again to show up, get grounded, speak your truth, kill it, get your confidence back, and do it again and again and again. And I think for those that here at the conference, I mean, if there's so many key things to take away today. That's one of them. It's just like knowing that you're not alone in these experiences. It's something we've all experiencing constantly.
Thank you, Sharon. And I think that's a great way to end what you were saying too, is even if you don't have somebody standing next to you, your employee, your team members, the female boss, that you still aren't alone, and to draw on that and to know and to reach out to someone who can, even outside of the moment, empower you. So beautiful, ladies. Vanessa, I want to come back to you. It was mentioned a couple times about the younger self, and that was actually one of my questions later. But because you work so closely, because you work so closely with families, what are some of the things that you teach young families to hopefully help breed really diverse and multicultural, and I say that with my air quotes, leaders as young children?
That's a good question. I think listening, communicating, showing empathy, being open to different experiences. A big word that comes to mind, a main word that comes to mind, is exposure. Exposing their children to different groups, different cultures, different experiences, different backgrounds. I find that exposure is very important. When we stay in our silos, we prevent the opportunity to learn from each other. We stay within our circle, we stay within our comfort zone, and that keeps us, that prevents us from exploring other situations, other families, creating friendships, building different strengths and skills that we need to have, so that when these kids are growing up into the world, they can become effective leaders. It's through that exposure, I think, that you have an understanding of diversity, an understanding of language, an understanding of different socioeconomic statuses, different ways of people, the diversity of thought, right? It's through that exposure, I think, that kids can learn to have that experience. And so I try my best to, even with me as an African-American woman or as a Haitian, sharing what my culture is like, right? Within reason, of course. Allowing them to ask me questions about my background, whether it be religious belief or my upbringing, my faith. speaking about my grandmother and how she raised me. Those are all important things. And so I think that in working with them, even though a lot of my work is either through the foundation or as a psychotherapist, I think that there's a piece of me that I can offer to them so that they can see a different side of everything, right? I have a professor from Pfeiffer University, Dr. Pearl Wong, who shared with me, she said, when you show up authentically, show up wholeheartedly, show up with your full self, right? Show up with the hair, the makeup, the nails, the clothes, the way you think, the way you love, the way that you encourage. Show up with all of it because it's all important. It all plays a purpose. It all has a role. And so I'm very mindful of that. When she said that to me, I thought, wow, that's important to remember. And that also validates someone else, a young child who might be thinking, I want to develop into this, right? But how do I emulate that? Am I inspired by this? And so I'm very conscious of that. I try to show up as authentically as I can, help them to be exposed to different cultures and backgrounds, different experiences, ask questions, read different books, listen to different podcasts or TED Talks or whatever, so that they can have that level of exposure and have a better understanding of different groups, different cultures, different people.
Thank you for that. I'm going to Zilka. Zilka, because you've had such a diverse background and you've lived a lot of different places and you've experienced many different types of life in the war and in academia as a professor, what would you say that has been your biggest motivator to stay forward facing, to stay an activist, to stay a leader?
The biggest motivation in my life is my faith. So it helped me during the war to survive, but also to help other women and men. And it also served as refuge in post-war period when I had to deal with my own trauma. And it helped me when I was discouraged sometimes not to continue with my leadership in community and in academia, when I was told that I was not good enough, that I don't deserve the position. So it was always important for me, to have pillar. Apart from that, my family was another important pillar because they provided emotional support that I needed, and I could go there, talk to my husband, talk to my mom, and I would always find a solution and support. So these two things, my faith and my family, were always the biggest pillars for me in my life.
Thank you. And we didn't even get into the faith or the religious side of the multiculturalism, but it did come up over the last two comments. Lakeesha, Dr. Lakeesha, I'd love to come to you because you're living in a primarily Buddhist country, which Buddhism technically isn't a religion, it's a way of life. But I wanted to get your thoughts on when it comes to being in a country where it is we have a lot of ritual. I'm in Bangkok too, so there's a lot of rituals and faith that's involved, more so than stateside in the US. How have you navigated that, and how do you feel that does that empower or does that hinder leaders?
Leaders in general?
Or women leaders?
I guess I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, but what I will say is that this is my second time living in Thailand. So I'm Christian, and when I was here 10, 12 years ago, I worked for a Catholic university. It's an international university, Thai university. And so it was really interesting because the you know, there was mass every day if people wanted to go on campus. And at the same time, because we were in Thailand, there was a fusion, you know, so there was a wat or a little temple on campus, or we would have ceremonies that were rooted in Thai Buddhist tradition, you know, which were very special. So for the Thai New Year, as an example, you know, the entire country more or less shuts down for a week. But it's, you know, it's hard to, you know, in so many places, our celebrations are rooted in our cultures, right? And so the Thai New Year is intertwined with aspects of Buddhism. And I'm not an expert or a scholar or practitioner of it, but what I will say is that some of the rituals that we did were very, very tender and special, you know, in terms of, you know, the elders pouring water on the hands of people that would go. And we actually incorporated that, or aspects of Thai culture into the onboarding of our students. So most of the students there happen to be Thai. And so whenever we would, you know, start a new term with a new class of MBA students, we would go away for a weekend. And one of the highlights, apart from singing karaoke after the first, you know, group dinner with all of the faculty and the students, but was this very, very special ceremony called the Baisi. And so the faculty would, and the administration would sit at the front of the ballroom, and the students would come up, and we would tie strings around their wrists and, you know, share with them our well wishes for them. And that is certainly something that's intertwined with, you know, it emerges from the Buddhist tradition. So I think that in so many cases, our, you know, the dominant spirituality of a place is embedded in the culture of that place. And to the extent that we immerse ourselves in that, we experience various aspects of it.
Thank you. And I'm going to do a no-no, but I have to, because I've lived in different countries as well with different religions, living in Saudi Arabia, you know, and then living here in Thailand and traveling all over. And I'm going to go back to something that Vanessa said about exposure, which we're going to talk about in the next question. But do you feel, so it's a yes or no, it's a close-ended question, but do you feel, because you've experienced so many different religions and lived in countries where the religion was so present in so much of fiber of their life, that it's made you a better leader? And a really quick, why? Yes or no? So it's not a close, or not a close-ended question, so I don't feel like a jerk.
No, I would say yes, because it's helped me to understand. It's helped me to understand other people, their belief systems, their values. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Elizabeth, I'd like to bring it back over to you. You had started earlier speaking about Mother Earth, and I think you started going into that, and it was more the spiritual practice of the indigenous cultures that you've learned about, and how does that play a role in leadership in the indigenous world?
So, you know, every geography, every people that lives in a particular place and that has an ongoing relationship with that place will have different expressions, different ways of understanding what their purpose in that place is, but then also cultural practices that are related to maintaining very strong instructions that people believe that they have been given for how to live in that place, and ultimately how to take care of it and how to leave it better. So I don't know if you've been following the chat, but there have been some really interesting conversations regarding, you know, even the possibility of, you know, what does it look like when we, and this, I'm gleaning this from the chat, but what does it look like to assume that women are going to be more caring, compassionate, quote unquote, feminine leaders, you know, when in reality, we can't necessarily guarantee that. I think ultimately, there are a number of different tests, you know, that different cultural practices offer, the different epistemologies, the what we know and the how we know what we know. can offer to the conversation regarding how we take care of place. And unfortunately, in this day and age, all of those ways, all of those practices, even the very femininity of the earth is being assaulted. And so I think that we have to ask ourselves as leaders, as people who identify as women, people who identify as influencers in whatever sphere we're in, whether it's the home sphere with your family, whether it's a community space, whether it's a not-for-profit space, whether it's a corporate space, whether it's a global space, university, whatever it is, political. How are we contributing to the erasure of the practices and the ideas that that were in this place and have been in this place, that have been maintained by the people who were here before, and towards what end? Like leadership for what? Multiculturalism for what? You know, are we just trying to be women leaders who are then going to perpetuate additional generations of women leaders who are going to participate further in mass consumption and consumerist culture? Am I striving to create that next generation of women scholars who are going to be extractivists, who are going to take? Or am I thinking about what is my relationship to this place? How do I honor the people who took care of it before me? And what are the ways in which the balance between femininity and masculinity can serve to steward or leave it better than how I found it?
Absolutely.
Is how I am.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Love that. And Sharon, I'm going to come over to you, and I want you to continue with this topic because I think you have a lot to add as well. You lived in Hawaii and also Alaska, which is very indigenous in its own right, and with the communities. And so what would you add to the question and to what Elizabeth had said?
As far as, what was the question again? I promise I'm paying attention.
I need to do that. So my question was about the spirituality, and hers was more because of the indigenous side, but you were very spiritual. And how does that, the spirituality side and living in the two environments where it was very indigenous, and I'm being from Hawaii as well, and how really it is to empower the youth and to really give back to the land and to appreciate the sovereignty of Hawaii as well as Alaska. I know is very similar, they're sister states. Where do you feel that, what have you learned being in those two different states, as well as your spiritual practice in being a better leader for yourself and for others?
Thank you. I mean, for me, like spirituality, like when we talked, like the very first question, talking about multiculturalism and the inclusivity that it brings as far as like all the different cultural backgrounds, that's exactly what I was referring to. I mean, being Mexican, growing up in Alaska, and then spending a decade in Hawaii, like I've definitely had a lot of different experiences and a lot of different influences. I actually grew up in a very conservative evangelical home when I was very young. And so I think that, you know, that natural progression, you know, as you grow and you search out, you know, a more spiritual identity, I think that experiencing in Alaska and experiencing in Hawaii, these two places that are so, they're so beautiful because they're so connected to their land, and there's so much respect for it. And they're like, the climates couldn't be any more different. I mean, they're so also equally isolated. I mean, Alaska isn't, you know, completely, you know, they have land that's attached to them, so it's not an island, but there is a sense of isolation, you know, from the rest of the United States. And so it's kind of that's against the world mentality. But being able to really show up and be comfortable in my own level, like where I'm at spiritually, I think as a leader, not being afraid that it's going to take from anyone else's, experiencing and like appreciating everyone else's journey. And, you know, coming again from a evangelical Christian background and being aware that even like clients and followers also have that background as well. But because of the respect that I have for the different like backgrounds and practices, and the wanting to consistently educate myself on that, I think it's created a beautiful symbiotic relationship. Time.
Thank you. All right. Can you ladies believe it? We have 10 minutes left. So I want to go around the room and I'll call on you. And I'd like us to keep it under 2 minutes, actually 1.5 minutes if we can. So I have a little bit of time to wrap up. But I want to leave the audience with a bit of advice from all of you. There's been a lot of great nuggets and I'll do a quick recap at the end. But I wanted them to leave with one actionable item that you feel that they could do to leave the world a better place. I mean, we're all leaders, and I can tell you, you know, and Elizabeth, you were talking about this earlier, like I learned so much as a leader from my kids, raising my kids. So we can learn from all different ages, and no matter the race, religion, or fluidity, whatever, it does not matter. So I want to take just a moment, and what would be your one piece of advice to have our audience step into better multicultural leaders, and I'll use the air quotes, or those that have an understanding of multiculturalism in leadership. And Dr. Lakeesha, I'll start with you.
I would say to support others along the way. I think Vanessa, you know, when she spoke about her faculty, her professor that said, you know, show up in the fullness of who you are. I think it's so important that, you know, those of us who have had certain experiences in our lives, that we reach back and we encourage other people to show up as their full selves, because we're not often, or maybe even ever, given that permission. I think back to my early leadership journey, and I wore dark gray pantsuits because that's what my colleagues wore, and they all happened to be men. You know, and I thought, but I like color, and I like, you know, I like different styles, and I had to kind of navigate that for myself. But I think giving other people that voice, that agency to be who they are fully and completely, and validating that as someone from the outside will help them to develop that inner strength that makes them unique, special, and different.
Thank you, Dr. Lakeesha. Zilka. Unmute, sorry.
Okay. I would like to conclude this session with 3 words: networking, connection, and mentorship. This is something what we all need, but women in particular. And I noticed in my researches and in activism that women don't have time for networking. They are preoccupied with things to be done, you know, to finish everything, to do things, but they don't have time for networking. And I think that with networking, proper network connections and mentorship, we can help women to thrive and then to become better leaders.
Thank you, Zilka. Elizabeth.
So in terms of a pragmatic tip, it's homework for people, since I'm a teacher. Giving homework. So I would say take a moment, especially in this pandemic time. You know, COVID-19 has, I think, we all hear that it's exacerbated existing inequalities and inequities, but we also, I think, have to think about what brought us here, you know, in terms of overdevelopment, in terms of what is our relationship with the natural world, how do we treat each other, how do we take care of each other or not do those things. So the homework that I would give, or the pragmatic piece that I would offer, is take a moment, go outside wherever you are, if you can go outside, take a breath, and think about 2 questions. And this comes from a Maori scholar, Wali Penatito, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. What is this place and what is my relationship to it? Essentially, what is this place? What is my relationship to it? Who am I in this place? What happened here? And what is possible here?
Beautiful, thank you. Vanessa.
Forgive me. So I think of our now Vice President, Kamala Harris, when she says, I hope I don't butcher this, I may be the first, but I won't be the last. I love that. And that spoke really to me, to the core of what my grandmother raised me to believe in modeling the way, right? So how do I set the example, align with my actions and shared values, so that I can uplift others, but in a way that I represent myself. So opening the door, allowing for the opportunity to be extended to others. So I think that's the takeaway for me, is modeling the way, aligning with what I believe, representing that well, and opening the door for someone else to be able to step into that space with me and make it better, leave the world a better place, making it so that other young women who are observing and paying attention to what we're doing, what we're saying, can find inspiration in that, and saying that's a great road for me, and I'd like to be able to follow suit, and maybe create a new path, an avenue for myself and for other women leaders. So that's what I would leave with.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Sharon, what would you like to leave the audience with today?
I think my biggest takeaway would be, or I guess homework, as Elizabeth put it, would be to make the decision. Know what it is, like what is the legacy? What is the thing that you want to change? We talked about multiculturalism today and, creating more inclusivity and all of these things, but what does that look like for you? By yourself, like I tend to show up and have the mindset that I can change the world, that it's like a completely, possible thing, right? Because of the ripple effect. Like, maybe in this, that someone will be inspired and they'll do the thing and it does the thing that, affects the rest of the world. Like, who's to say? But I know that through the rest of us, like working together and us all taking that action, then we really can. And so I would say go and ask, what is your legacy, and decide to commit to making something happen.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you, ladies. What an excellent group to be able to work with on this panel discussion. It was profound, it was powerful, insightful, and inspiring. And I hope the audience that you were inspired by one or all of them in the discussions that we had. Please find them on social media, follow them, connect with them, make sure that you reach out, because this is how we would continue this conversation and continue this evolution and this growth of really learning how to be better leaders, how to be more open, how to make room at the table, whatever table that is for others, and how to let our own walls down so that way we could hear those people at our table. And really, I want to leave you with this, is that we can all be better humans. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you all. And great job, everybody. Great job, ladies.